Welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. We have a good 90 minutes here, but we definitely don't want to take up too much of your time in the beginning. I'm going to go ahead and just introduce our teacher today is Miha Sarani. He is a visual artist, art historian, and an art educator, UW alumni. He earned a BFA in painting and drawing and an MA in art history from the University of Washington. Miha's work has been shown at art museums, galleries, featured both at the University of Washington, our greater Seattle area. We're super excited to learn more about portraiture in history and through the times and just kind of spend these next 90 minutes with you. So I'm gonna go ahead and let you take it away from here. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's really wonderful to be back. As I said, University of Washington, and means a lot to me. It's home. I've graduated twice here, so I'm a double Husky, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about portraiture through the ages, and specifically how drastically it changes, both in terms of style, but even more importantly, in terms of intention. So I have a presentation for you, so you will luckily not have to be staring at me. Let me make sure here I'm sharing the screen. So, as I said, you will not have to be looking at me. And I just want to acknowledge the Coast Salish people of this land, and the land which touches the shared waters and of all the tribes. And one of the things I wanted to say before we get specifically into our lecture is that, and this is really very, very important, that hopefully there'll be some humor, and you might see some work that might inspire you, that you can explore on your own. But I do have to tell you that the art is very much a product of its time. So there's certainly a very high degree of privilege, particularly as we look over the 600 years. And so when we look at the early art practices, it's probably one of the best and oldest examples where white men have really established very deeply rooted rules for centuries. So that's something to keep in mind. And so the art making itself is very complex. It's one of those things that it's really interested me to become an art historian, to kind of help provide context for the audience, and not make it necessarily so far removed from people to where it even might put them off. So more than ever now, we need to make sure all the voices are heard. So I'm trying to bring you as much as I can. But that being said, I do have to tell you that tonight's lecture will primarily be focusing on the works of what we call the Western canon. And that's simply because that's my area of expertise. I wouldn't do proper justice to the portraiture practices around the world. So with that in mind, as Anna explained, I was born in Ljubljana, which is in Slovenia. And I graduated from UW twice with a degree in painting, and then with a degree in art history. So portraiture, what is portraiture? Portraiture portrait comes out of French word portraire, which means to portray or to present. And then eventually the idea is to capture likeness. So portrait is an individual work of art intended on recording likeness of the subject, which most commonly is an individual, but it could be, those exist as well. And then portraiture is a category at large. So the practice of portraiture has certainly evolved over the years. And often people are kind of wonder about the radical shifts that it's taken from something like this to something like this. And so today we are going to try to map that journey. And I have it a lot of time compressed into 90 minutes. So some of it will be like one of those sample cases of candy, some of it is filler that may not be the most exciting, but I try to leave out all the really bad candy. So let's look at it together. The first thing to remember is that capturing the world in pictorial representation has been around for a very, very long time. So some of the cave drawings go back to over 64,000 years, and they are these red stencil hands that you may see right here, which are marked with pigment. And then over time, it evolves into representation, trying to capture the likeness of individual. And of course, eventually, who do we want to capture the most? Well, we want to capture the emperor or maybe God, right? Because those are the entities worthy of capturing their likeness for eternity. And then with the medieval art, people start to kind of try to also capture different saints, perhaps Mary, let's do Christ. But what you will notice is in those early works that there's a bit of a lack of understanding of perhaps how anatomy properly works, or more importantly, how one might how proportions and space, so perspective. And so, for example, here we have an example from Filippo Lippi, who is an Italian painter. And you can see that he has managed to put the two individuals into this space, but the space is very compressed. I mean, logically, most of us understand that there's no way that these two individuals could coexist in that inside this very small room. Not to mention that if you start to look beyond, right, that perspective, that really high elevation through beyond the subject, the sitter, is quite steep. It's quite sort of radical. So we can get to some artists of a little more significance, somebody like Piero della Francesca in this very famous portrait of Duke and the Duchess of Urbino. And Urbino was, back in those days, for those of you who aren't familiar, if we kind of tackle a bit of the Italian history, Italy wasn't always a country. It used to be a region of smaller city states, duchies, and so on and so forth. So, for example, Florence and Milano and Venice and Urbino, those would all be like their own little city states. So they all sort of competed against each other. And sometimes, as with a lot of power sort of management back in those days, you might have individuals marry from different cities. And that's kind of what you see here. You see Federico da Montefeltro, who was the Duke of Urbino, and he was married to Battista Sforza, who was the daughter of the Duke of Milano. But look at how Piero della Francesca presents his subjects. First of all, you can see that Federico is wearing red, right? The color which is often associated with the imperial Rome and emperors. So right away, this is saying he's a leader. The second thing is you can see how both of them physically survey the land, right? They're basically towering over the land that they are in charge of. And what we see are these really great examples where there's a repetition of shapes, geometric shapes. So for example, when you see these triangular hills, right, they repeat, for example, in the bottom of his chin, that shadow in the bottom of his chin is sort of repetition of these little shapes. And therefore what it does, it basically connects him to the land. The other, the other aspect is, you can't really see it super well, but the ships have white sails, right? And then those ship sails, you see them in his collar, for example, right? The other aspect of this portrait, which is quite fantastic, is the fact that he managed to capture both of them from the profile. And there's a significant reason for that. Number one, because we've seen who's represented in profile, right? Leaders, kings, emperors, George Washington or Queen Elizabeth. I mean, leaders are generally presented in a profile manner, while God is presented in a frontal manner. So in this case, what we have is the two of them seen from the side facing each other. Also, Battista Sforza, her skin is very pale. And for a long time, it is sort of was believed that that was simply to indicate her nobility. But it's subsequently been sort of debunked as the fact that she was already dead by the time that this portrait was completed. So what Piero della Francesca was using was basically a death mask, right? So he didn't get quite the right tonality, and therefore she appears much paler than Federico da Montefeltro. And the other aspect of why he so successfully uses the profile is because Federico was what they call a condottiere. Condottiere is basically was basically a mercenary commander of an army, and he actually had an accident, which you can see right there. He was missing part of his face, an eye, and some of his nose was gone. So wonderfully, Piero della Francesca decides, instead of kind of highlighting that very fortuitously, he turns him to the side. This type of portraiture back in the day was also done in a very traditional manner of egg tempera or tempera on wooden panels. So what you see are basically two panels that would flip open, often as an altarpiece, and egg tempera, which is, for those of you that are not, you know, painters, is that in painting, what we use is, if you use oil paint, the binder is oil, right? Which binds pigment. Pigment is what gives it color. Now, back in these days, what they used to use was that they would use egg to bind the pigment, and egg would make the paint very opaque. So it was very, very difficult to kind of blend the colors and create those gorgeous passages and articulations of planes, because this egg tempera was very opaque. So if you were layering colors, they wouldn't necessarily lend themselves very easily for blending or for glazing, which is the case in this painting, because this is from the north. So this is Northern Renaissance. So we're looking at Jan van Eyck here and the Arnolfini portrait, which is one of the greatest works of art ever. It's, to this day, just a true marvel. And we're going to kind of quickly break it down today to see what makes it so special and so incredible. The first thing that you notice is how rich and luscious these colors are. And you can see these passages, for example, where the tone and the hues change, right? You can really see those shadows articulate her face, which makes it feel very three-dimensional. It has a sense of space. It has a sense of volume. Same thing is happening right there. The shadows. So all these things are achieved because he was using oil, and the northern painters were sort of more adept at this method of oil painting. The other thing that makes it so extraordinary is that this first of all, we look at her and you see that there's an allusion to fertility, right? She is holding up her dress, and at first glance, she sort of appears like she might be pregnant, even though she's not, because if you look close enough, you see that that's a bend of the dress. But it's almost like a prayer, you know, hoping that she will become pregnant through this union. Also, we know that this is meant to be seen as a sacred space, their bedroom. How do we know? Because the shoes have been removed, right? They're standing on holy ground, and therefore the shoes have been taken off. The other aspects that are really significant besides the drapery that kind of suggests that she might be desiring pregnancy are elements in a background. We see the oranges on a windowsill, and that fruit, the abundance of it, is particularly with oranges, it's a connection to Venus, the goddess of love. For example, there's a previous painting by Botticelli called the Spring, La Primavera, and what you see are oranges in this forest, meaning that the goddess of love, this moment of her becoming, has transpired. She has kind of become who she needs to be. Who is she going to be? And contrary to this painting, for example, by the same artist, a very famous, we have the Birth of Venus. Those are also orange trees. but there is no fruit in those trees yet. Why? She hasn't really fully come into her own yet. So there's this connection between symbology that we see, such as the oranges on a windowsill, love, and fertility. And that goes further because behind on the boat bedpost, we see St. Margaret, who's a patron of women and childbirth. And then there's the element of the dog that we see in the foreground, and dog is a symbol for fidelity. That's why one of those old uh, dog names used to be Fido. The other aspects are the rest of the symbology that is sort of scattered throughout this room. Everything is very deliberate. There are no accidents, such as the candle that's lit there. Candle suggesting the presence of God. Different stages of candle suggest different things. If the candle is lit, that means that God is in the house. If the candle has been blown out and you still see the smoke, that means that God was there and has blessed the room, but is already gone. And then the best part about this painting, which is truly mind-boggling, is this back mirror that you see back here, which reflects a scene that we are seeing, right? So if you kind of can imagine that what we're seeing is right back there, and it's reflecting back to us what the viewer could potentially be seeing, which is the artist and another person, right? Could be an assistant or whoever the person is. And also this the stations of the cross all around that convex mirror, which is absolutely stunning because this may not seem like such a big thing, but the reason this is so incredible is because Jan van Eyck is here sort of playing with the philosophical idea behind just painting as a medium. Because most people at this point in time would have, let's say, there's a term in paint, in art, we call the picture plane. And the picture plane are the physical parameters of the canvas, right? It's almost like an oculus looking onto another world. It's kind of like the little peephole on your door, right? You know that there's world beyond what you see through the door, but you don't necessarily are not focusing on that. The same kind of way is with canvases. Now, that's when you look at something like this doesn't mean that this person doesn't have ears or neck or torso or the top of the head. It just means that the artist is trying to focus your attention on this. But very rarely would an artist actually try to make you think what this subject is facing. In other words, what is on behind the painting where we exist, right? The viewer. And sort of it adds to this incredible complexity and this kind of really almost existential question that he's posing by saying there is a whole world on the other side of the painting. Just truly extraordinary. And then just to show you how absolutely stunning and brilliant this idea is, you might have seen that above the painting, there's a text, right? And the text simply says, Jan van Eyck was here. I mean, how meta is that? It's just so brilliant. It's like what you would find a graffiti on a wall, not in a 15th century Renaissance painting. But it also connects Jan van Eyck as the creator of this work, sort of kind of adds to this kind of parallel between God, the creator of universe, and then the mortal artist, sort of seen as a creator of that work itself, and sort of kind of elevating artists into more than just artisans that are, kind of craftspeople. And so now the idea of all that can be accomplished with painting really gets pushed to a new level with the artist that comes next, and that's Leonardo da Vinci, and his most well-known work, La Gioconda or the Mona Lisa. Now, there is so much to be said about this painting, and I can guarantee you that I'm not going to do it nearly the justice that it deserves. But I just want to point out a few things, what makes this painting so absolutely extraordinary. Number one is Leonardo started to use this process of painting, which is what he called sfumato. Sfumato is it literally it means smoky. So what he did is he realized that if you want to kind of guide the viewer and create a sense of depth and sense of space and kind of realistic space, what you would do is that the objects, the elements that are closest to the viewer, such as her face, would have the highest focus. And as you move away, things begin to blur, right? We all sort of think of that today as like totally making sense. But back in those days, that wasn't necessarily the case, because look at this Botticelli painting. Regardless of how wonderful it is, look at how sharp everything is, right? So it makes it almost, what it does is when you don't stage it that way, and so if I'm painting, let's say I'm painting Anna over there, I'm going to put her nose in the sharpest focus because it's closest to me. Then everything further away begins to blur. It loses that focus, right? So by the time I get to her shoulders, they're going to be blurrier. By the time I get to the background, it's going to be even blurrier. And that's going to create a sense of volume, a sense of three-dimensionality. Now, if I don't do that, things are going to look flat because everything's going to have, it's going to be like a poster, right? And sort of that's why when we look at something like this, it feels fairly, you know, very different than something like this. The other thing is his use of color. He is putting the warm and gold and in a foreground, which is where she is on this side of the balcony, right? You can see the bottom of the banisters right there. And then he's reserving the warm, the cools, the blues and stuff like that for the background to create that atmospheric perspective. And there's also little things like, for example, that in her, right there, you can see how the repetition of that windy road is sort of repeated in, it's a rhythm. It's like rhythmically repeated in the sleeves and her fingers, right? So it all connects. And on the other side, you have this aqueduct, which then corresponds to some of the repetition in drapery. And Leonardo would do something like that all the time. But I think the most significant element of this painting, what makes it so stunning and incredible and really kind of timeless, is that what Leonardo did is he captures her expression nanosecond before it turns into a smile. We all talk about the Mona Lisa smile, but if you actually analyze it, she's not smiling yet, right? These muscles are about to contract, which means that she is about to turn into a smile. And because she's not frozen in time, like for example, this is, it makes what the viewer does, the viewer projects that time stretching. And we kind of anticipate her smiling, even though she's not smiling quite yet. And it sort of creates artwork that's not frozen in time. It's not kind of immovable, you know, and that's absolutely incredible because it talks about the psychology of the sitter rather than just representing likeness. And so you can see right here this work by Raphael, which was really influenced by the Mona Lisa, which so many artists were, because Raphael would actually visit Leonardo's shop, his workshop, in the early 1500s when Leonardo lived in Florence. So naturally, you can see the influence, which then becomes this portrait of Maddalena Doni. But when you put them side by side, you absolutely see how much more just there's so much more to this painting because of these little nuances, right, that are sort of disregarded here. And once Leonardo kind of does this, it breaks down so many things. And so artists kind of start to really think about more than likeness. Perhaps we should focus on something that's slightly more internal, the psychology of the sitter, like what is going on in their mind. So we get images from Dürer when he's doing a portrait of his mother. We have, for example, this is Katharina van Hemesen. This is the first artist to ever depict themselves in front of to do a self-portrait in front of an easel, which will become a very common trope that we see in art. And then the next sort of revolutionary move, uh, really kind of piggybacking off that Leonardo, is this Caravaggio. And it's another fantastic example of an artist that is kind of really going further than what was being done at the time. So this one is called Young Sick Bacchus, and in fact, it's a self-portrait by Caravaggio, who was using a mirror to create this self-portrait, which is why it has such an odd kind of angle. But for those that don't know, Bacchus is a god of wine and sort of good time. In fact, there are parties in his honor called the Bacchanals, and so in a way, what he's saying, too much of a party can be a bad thing. So because you can see that on the his skin has this kind of greenish tint to it, as though he's not doing terribly well, like he's maybe partied a little bit too much. And when you start to look at even all the bounty around him, right, the leaves, some of them are turning brown, they're withering. The grapes, right, some of them have actually already started to turn, and even the peaches in the front are starting to exhibit some signs of age. So it's kind of brilliant way of saying, you know, uh, it's almost like a cautionary tale. Don't party too much. In a way, it's really apropos because Caravaggio is probably really embodies that notion of access to the max. As those of you that are fast interested in his life, you should certainly pick up a book. It will not disappoint. His life was quite extraordinary. But he was also so revolutionary in the sense of naturalism and the lighting, right? You don't see any background. There is no background. In fact, the lighting is so dramatic that is what they call tenebroso or tenebrism, right? Is this really exaggerated lighting, which he kind of picks up from. It's already some of it, which is the chiaroscuro, is what the Italians call it, or light and dark contrast. So you use shadows and highlights or light to help you carve that, whatever the subject is. In this case is a person, so you see the shadows kind of articulating form, and we certainly saw it wonderfully in the Mona Lisa. But at the time when he was doing this was not necessarily the acceptable form. In fact, at that time there was a con- competing school of thought, which was the Bolognese school, and it was called the Accademia dei Desiderosi, or which was founded in Bologna in 1582, and it was co-founded by this guy, Annibale Carracci. And Carracci sort of hated everything that Caravaggio stood for. He wanted a much more idealized, sort of traditional approach to art making, looking to old masterworks and antiquity versus painting, dirty fingernails and this pallor, which looks very sick. And in fact, Caravaggio was sick. That's why he used himself as a model, because it's such a apropos, uh, you know, moment. And that really opens up the doors. Caravaggio is one of the most influential artists with people who kind of follow in his painting tradition and his philosophy in painting, known as the Caravaggistas or Caravaggisti. And he influences a lot of the 17th century and further on. Among them is Artemisia Gentileschi. We have people like Franz Hals, who now write that element of psychology. It's about the internal of the sitter. It's not a king or god or anybody of really high standing. It's just called a laughing cavalier. And look at how wonderfully it sort of captures the other part of life too. It doesn't all have to be doom and gloom, right? In this case, it's now this looks like the kind of person you might want to pop out for a night on the town. They look like it would be very entertaining to spend some time in their company. And Franz Hals is also significant in what they called Amsterdam School, which is in the Dutch Republic, which kind of becomes the next center of the art making. Also, thanks to this individual, Rembrandt. And Rembrandt is an artist extraordinaire, as a painter, as a draftsman, and as a printmaker. Actually, he actually really largely helps develop what today we call modern art market. He at one point is the most successful artist and art producer in Amsterdam. Unfortunately, only to sort of take it too far and lose everything, including his house and his livelihood. But he was just an extraordinary artist, really interested in a lot of what we already saw with Caravaggio, which is light, right? Look at this painting. This may be a self portrait, but it's really an exploration of light. How does one capture that most unattainable of things? And so incredibly brilliant, because what he would do is, we were talking about those elements when you capture little details and put them into focus. Like when you look at his hair, you see this certain strains of hair kind of grabbing your attention. This is because he would simply turn around the brush and just cut into the wet paint, uh, showing you the surface below. An absolutely incredible artist, and only getting better as his career, or his practice turns into more later years. Look at this incredible portrait of Martin Luton. Also worth noting is that at that point in the Dutch Republic, they had certain laws, sumptuary laws, that would sort of prohibit people from showing off their wealth. So, what if you have 15 people in a painting and they're all wearing the same clothes, how do you differentiate between one sitter actually wearing really beautiful, expensive uh, coat versus his neighbor? Well, you go to somebody like Rembrandt, somebody that can really visually articulate uh, the difference between this coat and sort of the stiffness of the collar versus the softness of skin, the kind of harshness of the bristle of his mustache or his beard. That's what the sitters would pay extra for, is to go to somebody that could really adequately communicate those different sensations. And then one of the greatest portrait ever, which is a self-portrait by Rembrandt. And let me just show you some details, some close-ups, because they're absolutely stunning. When you see this little kind of light brown color right there, or there, it's almost kind of green, that's actually raw canvas. So he is painting so loosely. Look at that. That's absolutely extraordinary, right? You can actually see right there the texture of the canvas. This is proto-modern. Artists won't be doing this for a couple of centuries, because it's completely unacceptable for of an artist of this renown to paint loosely like this, to sort of kind of show the canvas. It's a big no-no in academic painting, and yet he does it so marvelously. Just absolutely stunning work. And one of the reasons for that, he's got nobody to really please here. He's not doing it for patrons, he's doing it for himself. And his prestige and his renommee and who he was is already sort of been cast aside. So he can really do what he feels like doing, right? Velasquez, another artist of incredible contribution to the canon of portraiture, with his portraits of popes, kings, and everything in between. And particularly, again, you see the influences of Caravaggio and then Rembrandt, right? These backgrounds that are sort of loose. They're not particularly well articulated. They just kind of are there. And then things shift, right? We are in Baroque period now. Now England comes into play. England establishes its own academy, and its first president is Sir Joshua Reynolds, who we see right here. This is part of kind of what they call swagger portraiture. I mean, look at it. This is grand manner portraiture, right? You have very dramatic clouds, sort of the element of nature. Look how heroic and sort of noble the subject is. We've sort of moved from the greenish pallor of Sig Bacchus, right? This is not so much about the subject. This is more about representing that subject in a very kind of elevated manner. At this point, also, we start having um, some female artists contribute to this. It's one of those things we were talking about earlier. Unfortunately, for a long time, women were not allowed to study formally with men. In fact, Angelica Kaufman, who was one of the co-founders of the Academy, was not allowed to take figure drawing classes with her male peers because she was a woman, and they sort of thought it was improper. But look at how extraordinary this portrait is. And it's brilliant on so many levels. She is presenting a sitter who is seen with a book or writing implement and paper. So she could be an intellectual, certainly what they would call in those days a person of action, right? People who read, who are lettered, are individuals of action. They do something for betterment. Um, right next to her, we see Minerva or Athena, who's the goddess of wisdom. So the two of them are naturally side by side. And also, kind of in a brilliant way, what Angelica Kaufman did is that Minerva, the artist Kaufman used to wear this belt that had a representation of a battle between Minerva and Neptune, in which Minerva, Athena, won. So in a way, this is kind of like women supporting each other and kind of helping elevate one another, right? It's a really wonderful portrait, and it's the colors, the everything about it is extraordinary. What is going on in America, you ask? Well, because we were in Europe at this point, a lot. One of the examples is this Gilbert Stewart portrait of George Washington, which has just a really wonderful history because George Washington had posed for Gilbert Stewart in the past. And Gilbert Stewart was one of those artists that sort of did a lot of, uh, you know, talking, chit chatting to maybe put their sitter at ease. George Washington, a man not known to really enjoy too much small talk, actually found Gilbert Stewart annoying and so refused to really sit for him in the future. But then Martha Washington asked George to maybe sit one more time for the portrait that would be for her. So it would be their family portrait. Well, Gilbert Stewart starts working on this piece and pretty soon realizes that this might be the greatest uh, likeness of the president that anybody's ever captured. So that's why this portrait is not finished, right? So whenever the Washingtons would say to Gilbert Stewart, "Oh, by the way, when could we take possession of that portrait?" He would say, "Oh, I'm still working on it. It's not finished," which is just it just makes me laugh. And speaking of kind of grand individuals, here's a great example of how intricate and how complex the whole thing can get. In this case, we are in the neoclassical period, and perhaps its greatest representative, Ingres. Here we are looking at portrait of Napoleon in his imperial throne. Let's kind of break it down a little bit. First of all, it's very odd how Napoleon is presented. You might notice that there's something very um, scary about how it's got this full frontal assault that he's looking at us. Well, that's not accidental. As you will see, Ingres really was looking to work at that point by Jan van Eyck, which was part of the altarpiece known as the Ghent altarpiece, which Napoleon's troops stole and brought to France. And God right? He is seen in this full frontal vision. I mentioned that at the beginning of the lecture. So, right, this correlation is certainly not accidental. It's very, very deliberate. But even other elements of what Ingres was doing are quite extraordinary. What Ingres was trying to tell the story with this is that Napoleon is the king of it all, which some of it actually gets lost in the final painting, but it's better seen in this in preparatory sketch, which is this. Because when you look at the preparatory sketch, the study, you might notice a symbol back here, which is sort of not as noticeable in the painting, and that are the coat of arms for several of the Italian city states, including the Papal State, Venice, and Savoy. And sort of what it does, it says that Napoleon is king of Italy. Not only does he rule France, but he's also king of Italy. You can see that's a papal crest, right, with the papal keys and the tiara, which is right in there. Um, or you have Saint Mark's lion, which is a symbol of Venice, right, which you can see in there too. So it's really kind of fascinating. It's really art as propaganda in a way. He's trying to kind of connect Napoleon to emperors, and he's doing also that through this kind of the colors, as well as the eagles. The symbology of the eagles that you see throughout are all connecting Napoleon to the imperial Rome, among other things, because in imperial Rome, once an emperor or a leader became an emperor, that made them half divine, right? You went from being a regular sort of person, whoops, now you're God. So this is certainly what Ingres is trying to communicate about Napoleon, because you see also how pale he looks, right? He sort of is like a statue. He is more than a human. And then the circles, right? Look at you have a big circle and then repetition, 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 repetition. So it's almost like concentric circles on a bullseye of a map that draws you to his face. So you sort of can't avoid it. You're just, it's like a it's like a beam calling you. And when we're talking about the ability to capture uh, texture, I mean, look at this. You can see the softness, the richness of his robe, and yet you feel the cold, harsh marble of that sphere, right? I mean, his brushstrokes are absolutely extraordinary. I'm not necessarily a big fan of Angra, but I will tell you what, this level of skill is extraordinary. But one of the things that I really find quite rewarding about this work is that at this point, artists sort of became really they saw art making as a philosophical exercise. It's no longer just something they do. Is they're philosophers. They're just using different language, right? And so what they will often do is they will reference things that had occurred in a past, or tip a hat to an old master of some sort. And it's sort of, it's very rewarding for the viewer, or whoever the recipient of this is, when they catch things like that. It sort of is like when you're listening to, you know, Radiohead's Karma Police, and you notice that there's a line of notes that is basically a repetition of one of the Beatles songs. It's such a wonderful little, you feel so like, ooh, I'm in a know. Well, what happens here is that on this tapestry, you see this beautiful kind of these designs that are here, and look at the reflection on gold. So anyways, you see this discarded in a corner little design. This is a reference to one of his artistic idols, which is Raphael. And specifically, Angra is referring to this painting known as Madonna della Sedia. And you can see right here that this is a simplified, stylized image that is this image. But Angra has done that before. And subsequently, for example, in this portrait of Monsieur Riviere, if you look back there, right,
I have it blown up for you. It's the exact same image. Again, he's used the same imagery. Then, in this portrait of Raphael, painting one of his most famous works known as La Fornarina, which you see right here. But what's behind? Once more, Madonna della Sedia. And then, just the last one more, Madonna della Sedia. So I find this such a great little nugget of information kind of buried in there. And then there's a major change, and that is in 1826, the first time somebody captures a visual record uh, with what they call the camera obscura, which is this right here. It's a first photo in a way, right? Although this they had to enhance it just so you could see exactly what it is that you were looking at. This process took 8 hours, but fairly quickly, um, individuals figured out how to capture it with intention. So by 1837, we have the first form of photography, which is known as daguerreotype, after Louis Daguerre, which spreads like wildfire. One of the reasons is because Louis Daguerre gives the patent to his invention for free to anyone, not only France, with the exception of England, which is why English have to come up with their own concept. But an American student who is studying art in France at that time, by the name of Samuel Morse, you may know him as the individual that invented the Morse code, comes back to America bringing this new patent. And pretty soon we get photography in America, which is why photography in America really captures on very, very quickly. But what does that mean for painters, particularly, most notably, for portraitists? Well, this is a major impact on painters because all of a sudden, if if majority of the portraitists were kind of trying to capture likeness of someone, right? Now that is sort of what's the point? Well, who's going to want to sit in front of a painter for I don't know how many sessions when you could get it done right away. And even regardless of how great the portraitist, the artist is, it's still never going to be as true as a photograph. So now painters start to go beyond that. They start to say, well, maybe it was never really about just representing what we see. Maybe it was about other things. And this is a great opportunity to kind of start anew, right? So, in the middle of the 19th century, we kind of have this birth of modern art, right? People start to kind of, the modern artists, people like Manet right here. This was highly controversial painting when it was exhibited in 1863 Salon des Refusés. Um, Most people today wouldn't even bat an eye for this painting, and yet this painting was scandalous. And for some things that most of us wouldn't even notice. For example, it's the context, right? It was absolutely okay to put figures in the nude as long as they were sublimated, if they were idealized, if they were representations of something, Venus, Ariadne, you know, whatever, allegory. But in this case, she is none of those things. She's just simply a person who is sitting in the park in the nude with these two gentlemen, which is completely unacceptable in 19th century, France. But it's also how it's painted, because now there's sort of lack of attention to the kind of academic detail that we have seen up to this point. Number one, you may not even notice this fourth person, and right next to her there's a boat. And sort of the scene makes sense until you actually start to look at each element and you realize there's absolutely no way that she could ever fit into that boat, right? The perspective is completely out of whack. It's not properly staged. It's not properly executed, right? And the other aspect is the fact that Manet, look at how loosely that's painted. That's not even a painting. That's an underpainting. That's like a sketch at best, right? So the fact that he would take it upon himself and exhibit this as a finished work, they saw as absolutely unacceptable. The idea, he's not alone. There are people like Whistler, who same year exhibit this one, Symphony in White #1, The White Girl, which again, it was a shocking, scandalous painting for a variety of things. But just one of the things is how flat it is, right? It's so flat, it's like design. The color relationship is really, it's more like it's starting to become abstracted. And in fact, Whistler would title his works with terms like symphony, arrangement, nocturne, to suggest that there's a correlation between musical notes and variations in color and tone. So the more abstract the title would kind of serve to for the artist to kind of exhibit that there's not necessarily a lot about the subject matter depicted, right? Even this very famous portrait of his mother is actually called Arrangement in Gray and Black #1. Because if you kind of look at it, it's not so much about the portrait of a mother, it's about the relationship of these shapes. We got a rectangle, rectangle, gray rectangle, so on and so forth. And really, it's like a pre abstracted abstract work. This opens up the doors for artists to really begin experimenting with subject matter, and particularly when it comes to portraits, with how they paint. We got this beautiful portrait by Cezanne, Marie Cassatt. Why is this one in? Well, let me tell you, this one was highly scandalous painting because her mother is reading a newspaper, which was not uh, expected or allowed of women at that period in France. So women should not occupy themselves with matters of the world news. Rather, they should read novels. At least that's how they were. I mean, it's ridiculous, but that's how it was. Bert Morisot, look at how beautifully she captures the dynamic, the brushstrokes, the energy, the color. Really, just absolutely stunning work. And in fact, uh, Impressionists are among the first to really become their own very tight knit community. And so they have artists like Bert Morisot, they got Marie Cassatt, and they all exhibit themselves. And when the establishment sort of refuses to show their work, they just say, well, you know what? We'll just find our own way and show our works. And we get to Vincent Van Gogh. And there's a great example of somebody using color and the energy of brushstrokes to communicate something that is going on in the inside. When you and I specifically um, counterbalance two portraits here, so you can see that right here the colors are they enhance each other. They are complementary colors. They are colors that bring out the best in each other, right? So clearly, Van Gogh thought quite highly of himself at this point. And then, his mental state deteriorates and it shows in colors, right? These are very haunting colors. Even if you're not sort of put off by this sickly green back there, look at the color of his eyes, right? This is haunting. The brushstrokes, they're much harsher. They're really kind of almost angry. And the thing that is highly influential at this time is that in 1857, Japan opens its port to the West for the very first time. So there is an influx of these Japanese woodblock prints, like Hokusai's Wave and stuff like that. And so a lot of the uh, Impressionists and Post Impressionists are very much influenced by this new radical visual representation, the cropping, right? Things that are framed in unexpected way, the bold lines that kind of articulate the whole thing, the flatness of the print, right? So influence certainly shows in work by Gauguin, Van Gogh, Toulouse-Lautrec, Marie Cassatt, on countless, as well as the first of the sort of avant-garde modern movements when we get in the 20th century, Fauvism. In this case, Henri Matisse and the portrait of his wife, these are not local colors. These are not regular colors. These are made up colors, right? There are no people walking around with these colors on their face. As a matter of fact, look at the lack of the detail when it comes to sort of articulation of the face, right? Because that's not what Matisse is interested in. He's not trying to capture likeness. He is going deeper. He is going, he's projecting emotion, his own, that of a sitter, the relationship of colors, the movement, and trying to capture art that actually is a product of its time, right? The early 20th century. Why would we be painting like Rembrandt when we are no longer living in Rembrandt times? Art should really be a reflection of its own time. Here's another portrait by Matisse, and then comes his great frenemy, Pablo Picasso. In this case, portrait of Gertrude Stein, but here we have a self-portrait and then a really radical turn with this self-portrait here from 1907. At this point, the artistic gloves are off, as is naturally the understanding of this. People are highly shocked and puzzled by exactly what it is that they're looking at. Picasso's trying to capture the it's truly the sign of times, the fact that Einstein is proposing new theories about how time and space works. Time is not linear. You could see things from different angles. Painting is no longer meant to only capture likeness like a photo, right? So it's about Picasso's trying to re-examine the representation of the optical world, how we've been representing that optical world. And in doing so, it really, the assertion becomes that it's that no matter how well we have done it in the past, they never actually were representing that real world. It was always removed from reality. So if that's the case, why even bother? Let's forget the entire Western tradition of representational art because it's false. It was never real to begin with. So, what ultimately matters is how one feels and thinks about the object, right? Or the sitter or the scene, rather than trying to capture the likeness. So, modern art becomes about breaking the tradition with all that historic uh, tradition that we've seen. It's about its idea of simplification, reduction, and deconstruction, not only the world that we're seeing, but the world that we are representing. And one of the things that the artists are starting to do, well, they're saying, well, we can't look to this Western art, the classical approach to art making that we have been looking at for centuries. We can't be looking to the Greco-Roman antiquity. We can't be looking at Renaissance. We have to look at outside sources. And one of those, or some of those sources, are the African tribal masks and the Iberian art that they see in Paris, which was being exhibited at that point. So when you look at these masks, which were ceremonial masks, there's another example right here, you can sort of see how there's a translation there, right? There's an it's informed certainly by this aesthetic. And artists also are now saying that the idea is to sort of abstract objects from kind of their characteristic features. And some of that happens right here. He's abstracting it from what it should look like. But more importantly, one needs to distort those characteristics, or in most radical cases, completely abandon representation altogether. And what we get is abstraction, or pure abstraction, right? This is not representation at all, even though it's called painterly realism of a peasant woman in two dimensions. And so with the 20th century, there will be a lot of movements which will kind of circle very quickly and will coexist sometimes at the same time. So We have works by artists like Gustav Klimt working in Vienna here, which is influenced again with what came before, most specifically with the visit that he makes to Ravenna, which is in Italy, and he sees the Byzantine mosaics, right? Look at that. You can sort of see what informed this. And the other aspect of what is happening is that for the first time, the artists are actually trying to map the process itself. Because that's one thing, what can painting do that other mediums couldn't do at that point, other expressions couldn't do? It could really highlight the process itself, right? In other words, in much more classical portraiture, you would never see remnants of the original sketch. Look at in this beautiful portrait by Egon Schiele, how you can actually see the graphite the graphite indication of where the nose line should be or her lips. It's absolutely stunning. I mean, naturally, to the academic tradition, this is beyond appalling. This to them is not art. But this modern work is really focusing on a different kind of world, of different kind of representation. And I think that, again, it's like one of those things when artists are actually trying to show you that it's not, there's a human element to it. There's it's like if you listen to the Beatles, Abbey Road, and there's a track on there, Maxwell's Silver Hammer. If you listen very carefully, you hear Paul McCartney actually holding back laughter, trying to sing one of the lines. That little snippet of something human, it's truly extraordinary when you catch that. It really kind of, to me at least, it certainly makes that worth much more because it's done by someone like me, someone like you, someone like anyone. And sort of art uh, begins to take different permutations, different forms, different subject matter. We've had um, um, female artists for a while, and now some of those female artists are saying, the subject matter can be about what we want it to be. It no longer needs to gear toward towards what male collectors might wish. There's room for more than one kind of you know being. We see works that are quite um, transgressive in a way. This beautiful portrait by Frida Kahlo, in which she depicts herself and her husband Diego Rivera. What's extraordinary about this portrait is how she does things that may not even be noticeable right away. But in one of them is, look at where she puts herself, right? On his left. We've seen this before. We've seen it at the beginning with the Arnolfini portrait, right? The wife was on the left. Why? Because historically, wife was seen less than a husband, and left is generally, was not. It was a lesser side. Even when you think of word sinister, right, as in bad, comes from the word sinistra, or meaning left, going back to the Bible, because the thief on Christ's left was the bad thief. And when my mother was young, she was raised by nuns, and sort of they forbade her to use her left because left was seen as a bad side, the evil side, or not, good. Also, she presents Diego as a painter, not herself. She only presents herself as a traditional wife, right? But what's fascinating is that in the photo, because this is actually taken from a photo of their wedding day, she was actually on the other side. So this is intentional, right? She knew. So she sort of uses that to defer to her husband at that point, because Diego Rivera really was already a major artist of international renown at that point. And in fact, he would sort of shadow over her for the rest of their life. It wasn't until much later in her life that she begins to kind of claim and get that recognition as a major artist that she is seen as today. Katie Kollwitz, look at this. If facers are a window to who we are, this is absolutely incredible. Several artists who would fight, would take on the political machinery of some really difficult times. In this case, Katie Kollwitz working in Germany while being pressured by the German government for her political standing, which was very anti the national party at that point, or certain artists who, like Kirchner here, would be labeled as degenerate artists, meaning that their work was so appalling and so bad that it shouldn't even be considered art. In fact, the Germans organized an exhibit in 1937, same year as this is, which was called the Degenerate Art Exhibit and was visited by over 3 million people. It's one of the most successful shows of all time. It's just very sad what it represented, which was Germans using all this modern art, anything avant-garde, to sort of juxtapose it with pictures of individuals that had any kind of physical deformities or might have had to then say, oh, if you these are the artists, right? And this is why they produce this kind of work. Very, very, very sad. So you look at Kirchner here, who was just really gutted that he was included in that show. And sort of he presents himself with half a face gone. But more significantly, if you look at the back pattern, you see the swastika looming over him. And in fact, he would die by the next year. So artists have found a way to stand up to things and employ art as a tool to help them deal with so much. In case of Auerbach here, dealing with post-Blitz England, trying to make something out of the rubble that is London. Look how sculptural this looks. And it feels like it's painted with. It doesn't even feel like a painting. It feels like a sculpture made out of clay and mud and whatever was at hand. Absolutely stunning. Eva Hesse, look at this portrait, right? This is, even though it's not titled, we in fact do know that this is meant to be a self-portrait standing in front of an easel. So artisans are starting to really communicate how they feel about that subject matter or what they're trying to, how they're trying to speak on it, and also find their own language. One of my all-time favorite artists, Alice Neal, look at this beautiful, incredible portrait of a mother and child. And we have to talk about her portrait of Andy Warhol because it's absolutely brilliant. Not only because in this case, both the style, the execution, and the intention of it. Andy Warhol by the 1970s was a superstar artist. Most people knew of Andy Warhol, even if they didn't know any of his work. In fact, my kids, you show them a picture of Andy Warhol, they know who he is, but they couldn't name a single image. And yet, Andy Warhol is like one of those artists that truly handcrafted their brand, their identity. His persona, I think, was his greatest work of art, right? There were all these elements that all came together in a form of Andy Warhol himself. So he was always sort of seen in this traditional, the silver wig with the sunglasses, most commonly with a turtleneck. But what we see here is a introvert, a sad sort of somebody who's afraid to even open their eyes and look back at the viewer, as though somehow shamed by how they're being presented. And also what you see is this horrific scar on his torso, which was 2 years prior to this. Andy Warhol was shot by Valerie Solanas, and it took in fact, he would have complications from that surgery for the rest of his life. You see him wearing a corset, which he would have to wear in order to kind of keep his organs all in place. And he seems frail. He seems, you know, sad and alone. And the fact that he is against this bare, stripped down kind of background or lack of it, it just seems to isolate him even further. He's sitting on this couch that's not even a full couch, just really speaks on the isolation of that fragile human being, which is just, I think, is an extraordinary portrait. And then from work of Andy to work by Andy, a brilliant series that he does of Mao Zedong, in which case he used, there's two different versions. There are several different versions. So what he used a combination of paint and silkscreen. And he used the image of Mao Zedong from the Mao's famous Little Red Book, which was his communist kind of manifesto publication. And then he actually created hundreds of these images, right? In a way, turning the image of Mao into this kind of supermarket product, the way he did with his Coca-Cola bottles. So now he actually makes Mao a a product of the consumerism, which is the building block of capitalism and everything that communism sort of opposes. So in a way, he's managed to turn himself, Mao, into Mao's worst enemy. On top of it all, he adds these color splashes, right, which literally deface his image. And it becomes an act of rebellion against the communist propaganda. So, in a way, once more, he is using the image of Mao against himself. And then by adding these modernist art devices like the expressive brushstrokes, the brushstrokes are often considered kind of, you know, part of a personal, like very personal expression. And that personal expression is artistic freedom, which is, again, everything that the Cultural Revolution in China was against. So he really kind of takes this fantastic approach to speak on things in a wonderfully creative way. We have an example here of a portrait by Hannah Hoch, who is one of the most extraordinary collage artists of all time. This is a life portrait in which she includes photographs of herself from her entire life, from little baby to little girl to young artist working in Weimar Republic to you know, to the older individual, and absolutely incredible. We got works like Philip Guston. This is a self-portrait, or at least it's an avatar for the artist. This kind of kidney bean looking shape with a big gigantic eye becomes a representative of the artist Philip Guston himself. We have a marvelous self-portrait by Jacob Lawrence, Kerry James Marshall, one of the most extraordinary artists working currently. Look at this reinterpretation of the Mona Lisa by Basquiat, Keith Haring, who started with doing graffiti on subway trains in New York City. Luc Tuymans, Belgium painter, who is still currently practicing. We got Marlene Dumas, who is a South African painter, deals with portraiture, often using photographs and materials borrowed from publications, magazines, stuff like that. Our own and Gail, an extraordinary, I can say firsthand experience that she is absolutely an incredible artist, as I've had the opportunity to study with her. Adrian Geni, Romanian painter. Look at this extraordinary portrait of Darwin. I mean, it's incredible. This is something that photography actually couldn't really do. And so you can see really what I'm trying to show you as we move, just how many different stylistic voices there are when it comes to portraiture. And it's certainly not about simply just capturing likeness, because guess what? Camera can do that so much better. To one of my favorites, which is this portrait by former President Barack Obama. And what makes this portrait so extraordinary is that um, historically, whenever we looked at portraits of you know um, leaders or even former presidents, kings, queens, dukes, stuff like that, generally they are depicted from our point of view is lower. So we are looking up at the viewer, which gives them a sense of authority, right? Because as children, the people that we look up to, the authority, the teachers, the parents, the people we look to on our level are our peers, often our siblings. They don't have any standing with us. It's people that are grown-ups, adults. So that's why often the portraiture has kind of established this point of view that the viewer is lower looking up. And yet, but what happens with portrait of President Obama? You are looking at him eye to eye. This is democracy, right? We are equals. I'm not above you, you're not above me. And so I think that this choice of where he puts the point of view is absolutely extraordinary, and just really speaks to to the subject in this case. Some artists like Ai Weiwei using Legos, because that's what it is, and just to show you how extraordinary it looks. Look at that. These are all portraits made out of little Lego blocks, that we step on when the kids leave them scattered around the floor. Just think of it. It could be in artwork. And some of the most recent pieces, such as this Jordan Castillo beautiful portrait, and George Condo's father and daughter with face masks from last year, clearly a reference to, again, sign of times with COVID and everything. So I managed to bring it into 10 minutes before 7. So I wanted to open up if there are any questions or anything I may be able to clarify, or if I know.
Well, thank you. That was, I mean, I personally, I learned so much. It's really interesting to
Thank you.
just learn about the styles and as they change. Definitely, if anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat. You can raise your hand as well, and I can call on you to go ahead and unmute, keeping an eye on that participant bar there. Miha, I hope you can see the chat getting some kudos. I recently, I don't know if anyone else has seen that there's Rubik's Cube portraits now, which that just blows my mind, similar to the
The Legos.
yeah, the Legos.
Yeah. When my kids were small, they used to those Legos would be found all over the floor. I could have just thought like, wow, maybe one day this is going to be worth a lot because they're going to do portraits.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat so far.
Well,
Raised hands. So I think we can go ahead and close. Do you have any final thoughts to leave us with?
I was just going to say, like, there's so many practices, and this is just portraiture. We didn't even get into other forms of painting, abstractions or genre scenes or stuff like history painting. So if any of you are interested, there is truly a sea of information out there, and just started like pull a thread. if there was an artist that you saw today that sparked your interest, look at that artist, and it's like a domino effect. You know, next thing you know, you're gonna just, you might find yourself spiraling down and collecting the names of all different artists and interests. So that's it.
Great. Well, there were just a few questions that popped up, so I'll go ahead and read
Oh yeah,
those. And
absolutely.
then Erica, after I read the ones from the chat, I'll go ahead and let you unmute. But the first question we got is, how do you anticipate portraiture evolving in the far future or potentially in the near future too?
That's a great question. As a matter of fact, the last show I did, which was last year, kind of was posing that question: where is portraiture headed? And I think that there will be, and particularly also because the audiences want to participate, right? People want to kind of be able to. I think the digital is certainly going to play into it, to a great extent. I think that with the ability of different platforms, to where the portraits could sort of, you scan over them and they shift or evolve. They have done some really interactive, fascinating things with Van Gogh. There was even a film of some, you know, kind of going beyond just simply taking a painting as it was and then kind of animating it to make it come alive. So I think that there are endless possibilities, and so I'm really eagerly awaiting to see what comes next.
And then Erica, do you want to go ahead and you can go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
Oh yeah, I'm really struck by how art is always controversial, no matter when it's created. And we look at the old masters and we think that, yeah, that's a great painting, but it seems like in its own time, a lot of the paintings were decried by people around.
Sure.
And even now, obviously, some of the stuff that you showed in the end, I'm sure there's a million people who just hate it. You know, that's not a portrait.
Sure. And you know, the truth is that when I was compiling this slide list, there, for example, there are artists whose work, the ones I chose, I just kind of are helping point to, like, we're working with portraiture. So for example, with Caravaggio, we used that portrait of himself as Bacchus. It's not one of my favorites. I don't think it's necessarily even one of his best, but it fit into category that we have. But I also try to keep in mind stuff that was not necessarily, I was trying to keep it audience friendly, let's say. And, you know, when you get to somebody like Caravaggio, as I said, there's certainly a lot to be picked at and probed. And even Da Vinci, a lot of artists were quite transgressive in what they were doing, and it may seem to us today completely innocuous, like that portrait of you know, Marie Cassatt's mother reading a newspaper. Who would think today, oh, this is going to be controversial? Why? Because a woman is reading a newspaper? You can't be serious. But you know, you could really pick at uh, um, a lot of these artists and really, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's always, it's a conversation, and I love that, you know, that you can sort of kind of dig into it. And there's this quote by Picasso, and is another thing is, you know, I there's certain artists that as time goes on, we kind of look at them and we ask, should we reevaluate? Do we need to reevaluate? How much do we take into account? And, you know, the truth is, personally, there are certain artists that, for example, like, I used to love Degas. Then I read Degas was very anti-Semitic, and I had no problem sort of dropping Degas like a hot potato, right? But there are certain artists, for example, like Picasso, which I understand, you know, that there are several things that he that were quite questionable, and yet it points to my own hypocrisy, because I still catch myself looking at Picasso thinking, wow, that's really cool, you know. So how come I don't disregard Picasso the way I did Degas? And so there's a lot. There really is a lot, and constantly we know more, we learn more, we grow, we mature, we experience things, and, you know, hopefully find a kind of trajectory of artists that we like and inspire us. And so, you know, and how revolutionary some of them are. there's works by Picasso today, for example, again, Picasso or Matisse, that were quite radical at the time when they came out 100 years ago, right? And yet people would look at them today and say like, yeah, that's not all that. It doesn't look that crazy. And yet there are artists who really are visionary in looking beyond. You look at somebody like Duchamp and his large glass. People look at that painting today, if you could even call it a painting, and it's as radical today as it was 100 years ago when it was produced. I show it in lectures, and my students still are like it was done yesterday. It's so contemporary. It's so ahead of its time because it's kind of timeless. It's outside of all the parameters of what we were discussing. It's not on canvas, it's on glass. It's not in oil, it's in oil and dust and all these other things. And so, good art is tackling the issues of the time. Great art is looking ahead. It's looking for things that will occur, like that thing with Picasso and the Mona Lisa, right? How could he have anticipated things that he did? Just by simply thinking, I'm going to go further than just capturing likeness. I'm going to add the psychology of expanding time. Think about it. They thought the earth was flat. He's talking about expanding time, viewing time. To me, that is truly a sign of somebody extraordinary, you know.
Yeah, it's definitely extraordinary to think about. I'm going to go ahead and just read off a few more questions from the chat. For those who can stick around, that's wonderful. Just let me know if we're cutting into your time, Miha. And
Oh,
I also
no,
just
I'm
want to
good.
let everyone know who's here. Miha's going to be doing a few drawing classes for us. We're going to do 3 classes, 1 a month for the next 3 months. So definitely come back and register for those once we get those
All
up.
levels accepted. Please do not feel at all like, oh, I don't draw, I haven't done it. This is really for anyone that just wants to do something with their hands when they're watching the news because they get bogged down by what they see on TV. So you have a little sketchbook and you just kind of start, doing your thing, capturing the world around you.
Perfect. So this question from Steve is, are there traditions of portraits in cultures that are not Western?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And like I said at the beginning, I'm not really knowledgeable on that. So I primarily focus on the Western canon. That's my area, but it varies from region in the world. Each kind of country and has its own traditions, its own cultures, and sort of really looks at different things within that portraiture, right? So I'm not the best, but there certainly are, but I'm not somebody to ask on that.
Yeah, I mean, it was also super interesting just to hear when you were presenting how different historic context, affected what the portrait looked like, and
Sure.
really reflects the time, obviously. Laurel asks, can you say a little something more about the Michelle Obama portrait?
Yeah. So Amy's portraits are really extraordinary. It's kind of taking, again, if you could take a photo, then you take a photo, and it has to do a lot with how you articulate the figure. So there are elements in specifically in the First Lady's dress that are really kind of feel three-dimensional, right? But then the portrait itself begins to get flattened. And sometimes, for example, we look at work by Kara Walker, who's another extraordinary artist, but unfortunately doesn't really do portraiture, so I couldn't use her here. But sometimes it's kind of playing with the expectations, or sometimes it actually talks about how people have been perceived in the past, right? So in Kara Walker's case, she uses cutouts like silhouette cutouts that look just like a black outline, right? So it's sort of, it connects to this idea of stereotype, right? Which is, it's not true. It's just somebody's expectations, somebody's what they think is there. And sort of silhouette is projection, same way with what you think is there. It may not be there, right? And exaggerated certain things. So it's a similar with the Obama, with Michelle Obama, is inverting expectations, what you expect generally of a portrait, right? With like, how much do you articulate and how much do you not make it like a photo, but actually point to the process itself, right? Something that no other medium can do, which is kind of, we're talking even with that Sheila earlier, is about leaving remnants of the process made. Yeah, it's a fantastic portrait. I love both of those, and I love that they had different artists create them too. You know, just really.
Yeah, I personally hadn't realized that. I didn't realize until you showed the two slides.
Yeah.
So the next question is from Michelle. It says, does the portrait of Napoleon, or did the portrait of Napoleon have two gold stakes in the shape of a V?
Yes.
And is that for victory or strength?
Good catch. That there's so much more in that painting that unfortunately I couldn't add, but like the sword that he has is a connection to Charlemagne, the Carolingian king. There's the hands on it are the baptismal signs. I mean, there's so much. And yes, those two are V. One of them is pointing to heaven, right? Because now Napoleon is divine. I mean, that portrait is really, and they actually hated it when it first was exhibited. They called it barbaric because they thought it was so over the top. Even Ingres's teacher, right, David, that he studied with, just said it was like horrible. And yet, I think it's extraordinary with the things that he accomplishes. I mean, I don't necessarily care that it's of Napoleon, right? But it's what he does, how he paints, the execution itself, the little nugget of information that he buries with that Raphael call out, shout out there. I find that quite extraordinary. And like I said, there's so many works that if you start going down that list, you will see one artist paying homage to others, Raphael, to Da Vinci to Verrocchio, who was his teacher. We all do it in one way or another. There are certainly little things that I put in mind that are sort of a nod to my teachers.
And then I guess one last question to close us out is, do you think the images of us on Zoom, WebEx, etc., will become the portraits of our time?
Well, the very first image that I had at the top was actually a drawing that I'm part of this art collective in Seattle, the Shift Gallery, and so we meet once a month, and it's all on Zoom, and it's a gallery, and this is called the gallery view. So the last time we met, I started sketching everybody because it's too perfect not to do it. And in fact, next month, because the gallery is closed, I'm working on a project with a friend of mine to where we are going to create an outside installation that's going to be put into this display window, which will consist of 9 smaller portraits against a black backdrop to sort of suggest this Zoom fatigue kind of state that people are kind of hitting a little bit. So I do think that there will be a lot of that. But one thing I do want to say is that the really kind of the most timeless art is the art that is not necessarily really responding too much to the events themselves, but rather kind of expand, goes beyond that. Like an example, like that's why, for example, like if you think of Jacques-Louis David and his portrait of Marat, it's kind of it's not really, it hasn't stood the test of time because most people have no idea who Marat is, and they would have to go through a whole course just to figure out who is this dead man in the bathtub. But if you kind of leave that open, it transcends those constraints, and that's the best kind of art. Whether it's writing, whether it's music, whether it's the things don't just react to things. Anselm Kiefer, his work is about dictatorship, but he didn't call out Hitler specifically. That would make it very kind of time specific. But this way, by kind of leaving it open, he actually opened it for eternity. And you could easily look at Anselm Kiefer's work today and be as moved, 50 years later as when it was first created. And it is as impactful, perhaps, as it was when it was created, because it kind of left that open. So hopefully it won't be too much of the Zoom art in portraiture, although I'm sure it will be.
So we might not be able to take too much more Zoom.
Sure.
Well, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
It's been a wonderful evening, and again, you're getting lots of kudos in the chat. Elizabeth
Thank you very
shared
much. That you're all very kind.
she wished you had been her art history teacher back when she was in college. We
Oh,
look forward
that's
to
so
hosting
sweet.
you
Thank you.
again.